have said, yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid 2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question, so that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, if you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil, and you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing, and that's still the case today. So of course prices went up, and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today, because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward, and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. In 2020, they were back to where they started in 2013, except worse, because the balance sheet was even bigger. It's not going to take 7 years this time. It might be more like 7 months. And the reason is twofold. Number one, we're more leveraged and the stock market is more bubbly. And so the whole thing's more vulnerable. Number two, the market has seen this movie before. Like, hey, we watched this play out. We know it doesn't work. And the Fed balks. Now, so if the Fed suddenly slams on the brakes, says we're not going to keep raising rates along the lines I projected earlier, okay, that might give the stock market a boost. And you can't assume that won't happen. You got to watch for that. But I would expect that things would have to get pretty ugly in all events before the Fed got that message. On the other hand, if Powell gets confirmed and feels like it's his last term and here's his chance to be Paul Volcker and he's just going to keep raising rates, he said, my job is to get inflation under control. The rest of you people, you're responsible for fiscal policy and tax policy and spending and shutting down the Keystone Pipeline,
welfare,
and all that. That's on you, not me. My job is to get rid of inflation. If he does that, and he might, you're looking at a recession, kind of looks like the global financial crisis, and hope it doesn't And there is a difference between extreme recession and financial crises. They're two different things, but they can happen at the same time as did happen in 2008.
In this video, Jim Rickards talks about the challenges and potential risks faced by the Federal Reserve in managing the economy. The central theme revolves around the delicate balance that the Fed must strike between preventing a stock market crash and avoiding a severe recession. Jim raises concerns about the Fed's ability to have perfect information, citing flawed models and the possibility of being behind the curve in recognizing economic challenges. The distinction between a recession and a financial crisis is highlighted, with historical examples used to illustrate that these two phenomena can occur independently. Jim Rickards emphasizes the difficulty the Fed might face in choosing between preventing a financial crisis or accepting a recession as a trade-off. The reference to Paul Volcker's actions in the 1980s adds historical context, showcasing a deliberate choice to induce a severe recession for the purpose of combating inflation. However, Jim Rickards notes that the current economic landscape is more intricate, with additional considerations such as systemic risks and the potential for a recession triggering a financial crisis. In conclusion, Jim Rickards underscores the complex decisions the Federal Reserve must make, acknowledging the uncertainties and trade-offs inherent in steering the economy and avoiding undesirable outcomes. Before we get into the video, can you help me to give that like button a little touch? All right, let's get into it.
Would the Fed back off if it became apparent that they were going to cause a stock market crash, a disorderly collapse, and a severe recession? The answer is almost certainly yes, but the problem is it might happen anyway. In other words, they might have gone too far, and this almost happened in 2018, and that was my point. It was that by the time they realized their mistake, it might already be too late. So that's one danger, which if they had perfect information, oh, gee, we went too far, gee, we couldn't pull this off, we need to back off. They might back off exactly as you described, but they don't have perfect information. They have flawed models. They tend not to look at history, and they could
behind the curve.
They could crash the car before they knew it was out of control. It's like slamming on the brakes on ice. You can slam on the brakes, but you're going to go for a long time before the car stops. So that's one problem. The second problem is you have to separate, as I said, recession, even severe recessions, from financial crises. In 1998, we had a financial crisis, but no recession. In 1994, we had a financial crisis, no recession. In 2000 and 2020, we had a severe recession, no financial crisis. That was not a financial crisis. In 2000, 2001, we had the NASDAQ collapsed 80%, but there was only a very mild recession, and that was not a financial crisis. So the Fed might say, and again, might, because who knows, but they might say, well, of course we don't want a financial crisis. Now, to your point, Nick, nobody wants that, and they do get out of control. But we're not worried about that. You know, we learned our lesson in 2008. We had Dodd-Frank. And I had this discussion with James Gorman, the CEO of Morgan Stanley. I briefed their board, and they gave me a lot of pushback. They said, "Oh, you don't understand, Jim. We have more capital and greater liquidity and less leverage and better credit." And I granted, I said, you're absolutely right. I said, nice job. You're a stronger bank now than you were then. But in a financial crisis, it doesn't matter. The problem is systemic. In other words, as an individual bank, you may be better off. But if the whole system's collapsing, you can't necessarily withstand that. So they don't want that. But what if they said to themselves, you know what, we don't want a financial crisis, but we don't think that's going to happen. But maybe we'll just have to bear a recession. Volcker knew what he was doing. Volcker knew that there was going to be a recession. And the recession of 1981-82 that he caused was, at the time, the worst since the Great Depression. Now, we've surpassed that twice since then, 2008 and 2020, although it's hard to know what 2020 was. I mean, down 36% in 2 months and up 38% the next 2 months. I mean, what is that? But at least in technical terms, we've had two worse recessions, 2008 and 2020 since then. But at the time, and I lived through that, I was around, that was the worst recession. But Volcker knew that would happen. He said, that's the price we have to pay to break the back of inflation. And he did. And by 1986, inflation was like 2% or 1.8%. Now, there was far less worry about financial crises at the time. Because remember, this was before the repeal of Glass-Steagall. Commercial banks, no one really cared about investment banks. They could fail. So what? They cared about the commercial banks, and they had a pretty good handle on that. So they weren't worried about financial crisis. But today you would be for the reasons we mentioned. So there are two possible major blunders here, but again, don't underestimate the Fed's ability to do both. One is that they could decide they don't want a recession, but not know until it was too late. They just tighten into it, don't know it until it's too late, and then the damage is done. The other one is they could sign up for a recession, say, yeah, sorry, but that's the price of getting inflation under control, and trigger a financial crisis that nobody wants but could happen anyway. So, it's kind of still in Charybdis, take your pick. Severe recession, but we know it's coming. Recession that causes a financial crisis that we didn't want, or just let the inflation rip. What's the good outcome there? What's the good one?
Yeah.
But I think those are the three choices. I think you're right.
In the face of these complexities, our discussion leaves us with three potential scenarios: the risk of unwittingly tightening into a recession, the prospect of accepting a recession for inflation control, or the challenging choice of allowing inflation to run rampant. The Federal Reserve stands at a crossroads, and the decisions they make in the coming months may well shape the economic landscape for years to come. As we conclude our exploration, it becomes clear that the path ahead is fraught with challenges and decision-making. The balancing act between preventing a stock market crash and avoiding an unintentional recession places the Federal Reserve in a formidable position. The lessons from 2018 serve as a stark reminder that perfect information eludes them, and the consequences of their decisions may only become apparent once it's too late to correct. The historical perspective sheds light on the dual nature of economic downturns, where financial crises and recessions don't always go hand in hand. Drawing parallels to Paul Volcker's bold strategy in the 1980s, we ponder whether the Fed might consider accepting a recession as a necessary sacrifice for taming inflation.
I can tell you exactly what the Fed's going to do, and you can do this at home. So if listeners want to take notes, it's really easy. First of all, what is the problem the Fed's trying to solve? What is their solution? And then what are the exceptions to that so that we can have a complete predictive analytic model? The problem they're trying to solve is the following. We know from a long series of experiences, 30 or more business cycles since the end of World War II, that when the U.S. is in a recession, you have to cut interest rates 3 to 4% to get the U.S. out of a recession. You need 300 to 400 basis points of cuts to get the U.S. It's like a plane heading for the ground. How do you pull it out of a nosedive and get it back up in the sky? The answer is 300 basis points of cuts. How do you cut interest rates 300 basis points when you're only at 75 basis points? The answer is you can't. And forget about negative rates. The evidence is now pretty good that negative rates do not work. In other words, negative rates are not more of the same. When you go from, let's say, a half of 1%, then you go to a quarter, and then you go to 0, and then you keep going to negative 25, you didn't just ease by another 25 basis points. The evidence from Japan and Europe is that you're through the looking glass and you have very strange effects, really unintended consequences. I'll give you a couple examples. So the conventional theory is, well, the more I cut interest rates, the more stimulus I get. That's a joke, but that's what they think. But if I go negative, you're absolutely going to go out and spend the money. Because if you don't spend the money, I'm going to take it away. You sit there long enough, you'll have nothing left in your bank account because I'm going to take, with these negative interest rates, I'm going to take it away. So people will run out and spend. And the other thing is that, it's obviously, from the lending point of view, they'll borrow money, because the bank pays you to be a borrower. But here's what happens in the real world. This is the difference between academics and human beings. When people see negative interest rates, people have goals in mind. They have lifetime goals, right? They want kids' education, parents' health care, their own health care, retirement. If you start taking their money away with negative rates, guess what they do? They save more. They're like, hey, I got to put my kids through college. You're taking my money away. I better save more. And then what kind of signal is the central bank sending with negative interest rates? They're sending a deflationary signal. So people go, well, if you think it's going to be deflation, I'm not going to spend money. I'll wait till the price comes down. So you're trying to encourage lending and spending. And what you get is more savings and no spending, deferred spending. You get the exact opposite of what you want. So again, another egghead experiment gone awry. But the point being, so negative rates don't work. So zero bound really is zero. It really is a boundary. And Bernanke has said this in his recent writings, and I think he's right about that. So back to the problem. How do you cut interest rates 300 basis points when you're at 75? Well, the answer is you can't. So you have to raise them to 300 basis points. So the problem the Fed is trying to solve is how do they get rates to 3.25% before the next recession? Now, I'm not saying the Fed sees a recession, and that's easy because the Fed never sees a recession. In 102 years, the Fed has never seen a recession, never forecast a recession, but they know their economic history. We are 8 years into an expansion. It feels punk. I mean, the growth is anemic, but labor force participation is low, productivity is dropping. There are a lot of bad things going on, but in fact, we are in the 8th year, actually coming up on soon be entering the 9th year of an expansion, which began in June 2009. Right. By the way, you have a hard time convincing most Americans that we're not still in a recession. Depressions are different than recessions. The technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP with rising unemployment, a couple other bells and whistles, little subjective factors, but that's basically it. So people, when you say depression, they're like, depression sounds worse than a recession. And if recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, then a depression must be like 10 quarters of declining GDP because it's got to be worse. But that's not the definition. The definition of a depression, you can have growth in a depression, but it's below trend growth. In other words, if trend is 3.5, and you're actually banging out 1.5, 2, that gap between, let's say, 1.5 and 3.5% growth, that's depressed growth. It's an output gap. It compounds over time, and you never get it back. We are losing trillions of dollars of wealth. We are impoverishing future generations on a relative basis because of our inability to get back to trend growth. So the reason American people feel this and don't listen to the economists, and they're right, is because we're in a depression. So leaving that aside, the Fed at least understands the business cycle and the fact that the next recession, they say they don't die of old age, but they do die, and we're getting closer to the next one. So they are in a desperate race to get rates up to 3.5% before the next recession hits so they can cut them to get out of the recession. The question is, can you raise rates enough to cure the next recession without causing the recession you're preparing to cure? That's the dilemma. That's the finesse. My answer is no, they're not going to be able to do it, but they think they can. Why are they in this box? Well, because Bernanke should have raised rates in 2010, 2011, in the early stages of the expansion, when the economy would have been much better able to bear it than it is now. Bernanke skipped a whole cycle. He skipped a whole rate increase cycle to pursue these wacky experiments and, QE and zero interest rate policy and all that. I spoke to Bernanke about this, and he used the word experiment. He said this was an experiment. Bernanke made his academic reputation by studying the Great Depression, in the wake of Friedman and Anna Schwartz and some others. But he was a great scholar of the Great Depression, and he got his chance to kind of try out his theories. But what he told me was, he said 30 years from now, some new Ben Bernanke, some young scholar will look back and tell us if we did a good job or not. We actually don't know right now. See, the Great Depression was really 2 technical recessions, 29 to 33, and then 1937, 38. But from 33 to 37, we had an expansion, but the whole thing was a depression because we never got out of it. The stock market recovered the 1929 high in 1954. It was a long time to get back to even. But Bernanke's mantra was, doing something is better than doing nothing. I completely disagree. It's better to do nothing if you don't know what you're doing. And this is really the monetary equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors say, first rule of being a doctor is first do no harm. Anyway, bottom line is, by pursuing QE and zero interest rate policy, Bernanke failed to raise rates during the early stages of a cyclical expansion, which he should have done. If he had, the economy would have been just fine, and we'd be able to cut them today, but he didn't. So Janet Yellen now has to make up for lost time. So that's the mission. But again, and this is what the market completely does not get. And the Wall Street economists don't get. Nobody gets this because they see the Fed raising rates. And they've done the correlations and the regressions back to World War II. And they go, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. So if the Fed's raising rates, the economy must be getting stronger. So bid up stock prices, et cetera. But that's like saying umbrellas cause rain. In other words, they've got the causality backwards. The Fed never leads the economy, ever. The Fed follows the economy. So a normal business cycle looks like this. So you get a little expansion going and unemployment starts to go down, and industrial capacity utilization starts to go up, and inflation starts to go up, and the Fed's watching, and then it keeps going. They go, it's getting a little hot. We better raise rates. And they raise rates, but of course they started too late. The expansion keeps going, inflation keeps going up, unemployment keeps going down. Then the economy starts to cool down, unemployment goes up, and then prices go down, and capacity utilization drops and we get into recession, like, we better cut. And then they cut and cut and cut and cut, and then you hit the bottom and then you come out of it again. So think of that as like a nice, pretty sine wave, right? That's a business expansion, business contraction over and over 30 or so times since the end of World War II, with the Fed always following the economy, never leading the economy. So all the big brands on Wall Street, they've got all this data and they say, well, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. That has absolutely been true for like 30 times since the end of World War II. It is not true today. The reason it's not true today is because Bernanke skipped a cycle and they're playing catch up. For the first time since 1937, the Fed is tightening into weakness. That's a key thing to bear in mind. The Fed is tightening into weakness. They are not leading the economy to strength. They are not responding to strength, even though Wall Street thinks they are. And there's a great danger that they're actually going to cause the recession they're preparing to cure, as I mentioned. The Fed will raise rates 25 basis points 4 times a year from now until the middle of 2019, until they get them to 3.25%. So like clockwork, every March, June, September, December, for 2017, 2018, into 2019, look for a Fed rate hike until they get to 3.25%, at which point they'll be able to say, all right, now we're 3.25. If we have a recession tomorrow, we can cut them back down to 0 again and get out of it. That'll be mission accomplished. Now, this is why I was sitting there in December like, yep, they're going to raise them in March. And right now, I'll tell your listeners they're going to raise them in June. There's your Fed response function. There's your baseline scenario. What are the exceptions to a Fed rate hike? Under what conditions will they not raise rates? Because everything I just described to you, they've had in mind since March 2015 when Yellen took patience out of the statement. That was the end of forward guidance. And by the way, if you go back to 2015, I said they're not going to raise rates all year, and they weren't going to do the liftoff that people were looking for in March, June, September, and they didn't lift off in September because the Chinese rate exchange devaluation, the stock market fell out of bed August 2015. Finally, they raised them in December 2015, and Wall Street was ready for March. I said, no, in June, no, September, no. It wasn't until December 2016 that they raised them the second time. So obviously, there are conditions under which they don't raise rates, notwithstanding the baseline scenario. So what are those conditions? There are 3. Well, 4 actually. So if you see job creation below 75,000, that will cause them to pause. By the way, pause is the key word. If you go home through the speeches, you'll see the word pause in Dudley's recent remarks. Pause is the Fed's jargon for we're not going to raise rates. We got the Jim scenario, which I took from the Fed, it's their scenario, or a technical recession. So, we're going to know Friday what the first quarter GDP is. It's pretty close to negative, but I'm not saying we're in a recession now. We might be. But if you see a recession, they'll pause. See job creation below 75,000, they'll pause. By the way, that's a very low bar. If you see a jobs report, see, this is the other thing that confuses Wall Street. You see a jobs report with 100,000 jobs. So Wall Street goes, oh, that report's really weak. The Fed's going to think twice. No, 75,000 is the number. Yellen told us that. It was in one of her speeches. You just have to be a geek like me and read all the speeches. So the third factor would be disinflation. So the Fed has this 2% inflation target. They missed it for 6 years. They're finally getting close to hitting it. By the way, I think the listeners know they use the PCE core deflator year over year. There's PPI and CPI and core, a bunch of inflation indices, but we know what they use. PCE core deflator year over year. That actually has been getting close to 2%. But if you see it turn around, if you see that gap down to like 1.5, 1.4, 1.3, then they will pause. The last condition for the pause is a disorderly decline in stock markets more than 5%. If you see a 6, 7, 8% decline, so if the S&P went down 100 points, Fed doesn't care. Dow Jones goes down 1,000 points, Fed doesn't care. But beyond that, if you see the S&P start to go down 150 or the Dow start to go down 1,500 points in a disorderly way, it looks a little scary. It looks like there's no bottom. It looks like if you see that, they'll pause. So the Fed's going to raise like clockwork 4 times a year for the next 2.5 years, unless you see job creation below 75,000, disinflation, a technical recession. If you don't see one of those things, they're going to raise rates. And so right now, I don't see any of them. I mean, they could all happen, but it looks like, growth is going to be positive. Job creation's been decent, over 100,000. Disinflation is probably coming, but not quite here yet. And they'll want to see a couple months in a row. and the stock market's not crashing. So none of the pause conditions are in place. Therefore, they will raise rates. Simple.
But the Fed has a hidden asset.
What is the hidden asset? And how do you make millions from it? According to Jim Rickards, the Fed has a hidden asset called gold certificate. It's something that the Fed can and will use in times of emergency when we return to the gold standard. How and when the Fed will use it? Well, they'll use it to back the dollar when the dollar collapses and people no longer trust it. The Fed needs thousands of tons of gold, so they'll buy it from the public. So, what is exactly this gold certificate? Let's hear more from Jim Rickards.
If you go to the balance sheet, go to the asset side, the first line item, there's something called gold certificate. And what is that? Well, in 1934, the U.S. Treasury confiscated the Fed's gold. They had already taken the gold from U.S. citizens by that point, but they wanted it all. And so they took the Fed's gold, but under the but again, bear in mind, the Fed's privately owned. So under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it is illegal, it's unconstitutional to seize property without paying just compensation. You can do it, but you got to pay the person. And then people get into all kinds of arguments about what it's actually worth. So what just compensation did the Treasury give to the Fed when they took the Fed's gold in 1934? The answer is they gave them a gold certificate. It can be, you can calculate it. In other words, you can say, well, what is the amount of gold by weight, not by dollar value, but by weight that is needed to back up that certificate given the historic cost? Well, the answer is about 8,000 tons. Guess how much gold the Treasury has? About 8,000 tons. I mean, one of the reasons I've hypothesized that the Treasury stopped selling gold in 1980 because they lost gold to trading partners between 1950 and 1970. They lost 11,000 tons. They went from 20 to 9, but they sold another 1,000 tons in the 1970s to suppress the price of gold, which failed because it always does. But by 1980, they had were down to 8,000 tons and they stopped. Why did the U.S. stop selling gold? We've never sold any significant amount of gold since. The answer is, in my view, is that they can't go below that because that's the amount of gold the Treasury needs to back up this gold certificate on the Fed's books. So, okay, just kind of put that to one side. That asset is valued on the Fed's balance sheet at $42.22 an ounce. The price of gold, look today, it was about $1,850 an ounce. Now, so, what's, as I say, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we're going to mark the mortgages to market in a world where interest rates have gone up and the mortgages have gone down, it's only fair to mark the gold to market. And if you mark that gold to market at $1,850 an ounce versus $42, voila, you would find that the Fed has another approximately $350 billion of hidden assets. So I think that takes care of the solvency problem. So before we beat up the Fed on mark to market on mortgages, that's fine. But have a look at the gold and realize that they have a hidden asset, a shadow asset on their books that's worth in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
We've heard from Jim that the Fed has hundreds of billions of dollars of a hidden asset, and that hidden asset is a gold certificate held by the Fed and backed up by real gold in the U.S. Treasury. When the time comes, the Fed will definitely use it to back the new dollar. They'll even buy more gold from the public, and therefore the price will go up significantly. But how much exactly is the price of gold will go up? Is it a big deal?
I think it would be a very big deal. But it begs the question, if you're going to revalue it, to what level do you revalue it? So everyone said, well, the market's 1850, that's about where it is today. It goes up and down, but so revalue it at 1850. That could be highly deflationary. And the reason is, in effect, you're putting yourself on a gold standard. You don't have to. That's why they won't do it. They don't want to touch it. But if you did, you would be saying, hey, gold's really worth 1850 and we have this much gold, et cetera. But at that point, analysts would sort of turn and say, well, okay, well, you're back to a kind of gold standard. What's the relationship between gold and money or currency or U.S. dollars and others, the money supply? But what is the relationship between gold and money supply? What you would find is that at 1850, the gold relative to the money supply is about 2%. Whereas historic gold standards were run with somewhere between 20 and 40%. Bank of England in the 19th century managed a successful gold standard between the Congress of Vienna and World War I with about 20% gold. In the US, through most of the 20th century, at least the first half, ran a gold standard with about 40% backing. It was actually the law. The law until the late 1960s, I think 1968, was that the Fed money supply, base money, could not be more than 2.5 times the value of gold. Originally at $20 an ounce, $20.67 an ounce, later $35 an ounce. But whatever that number was, times the amount of gold, that had to be 40% of the money supply, and the money supply could not be greater than that. And then they got rid of that in 1968 because of the war in Vietnam. But the point being, 20% has worked. 40% definitely works. The Austrians like to bang the table and insist on 100%, but maybe, but that's historically not been required. You just need enough gold to be able to give gold to people who want it when they want it. And if you're credible in that dimension, most people are content to hold the money. So as a hypothetical, you can say, well, okay, let's say we want a gold standard, and let's say that we want 40% backing of M1. M2 is a bigger number, or at least it can be. Let's just say, so 40% backing of M1, that's a conservative kind of gold standard, not extreme, but reasonable.
From February to March 2020, the Fed has printed $2 trillion. The impact of that is our money supply goes up, and so does our inflation. With massive price increases in food and energy, gold prices would have to rise too, right? And if the Fed uses 40% gold backing to back the new dollar, and with the current high inflation that we have, what would the price of gold be? Jim Rickards gives a staggering gold price prediction. Let's listen to Jim.
What would given the amount of gold the United States has, what would the price of gold have to be in order to maintain that ratio? The answer is about $15,000 an ounce. And people say, well, Jim, you used to say $10,000 an ounce. Well, that's true, because it was true at the time. But when you expand the money supply, the number goes up, right? Because the amount of gold is fixed. So yeah, it was 10,000 not that many years ago, and today it's 15,000. Well, if you say gold's worth 1,800, people are going to say, well, give me the gold. I'll take all the gold you got at that price. And then they're going to have to shut the gold window again, and that has its own problems. But in other words, it's not clear how it would work. I mean, there are a lot of ways it could work mechanically. It's not clear what the government would actually do. But my point is, if you try to mark gold to market on the Fed's balance sheet, you're opening Pandora's box. Because you would be getting a lot of people, bankers, analysts, Wall Streeters, investors, to sit up and take notice and say, well, hey, what is going on here? You're back in the gold business. Well, you got the price wrong, because you can't back up your money supply at that level. And the truth is, you can't. Why are those residential real estate prices going up? And the same thing's happening in the United States. The answer is that there is an exodus, and I don't think that's too strong a word, out of the cities. People are put off by, cities have always been a trade-off. Cities are, okay, you have a lot of noise and some dirt and some hassles and maybe a slightly higher crime rate. But on the other hand, you have art and culture and museums and shows and restaurants and bars. And so you make the trade-off. You say, I'll accept these annoyances in exchange for all this, culture and buzz. And cities attract, the brightest people. So whether it's bankers or lawyers or doctors or artists, playwrights, actors, whatever. It's just, there's a lot of buzz. That's why people go to cities. With these lockdowns, we've amplified all the negatives and taken away all the positives. We've shut the museums, the restaurants, the bars, the plays, the office buildings, things that attracted people. But meanwhile, again, probably not as bad in Australia as it is here, but crime is on the rise. Murder rate in New York has doubled. Suicide rates across the country have tripled. And that's New York. The suicide rate's national. There are all these dysfunctions, and a lot of them, and of course, when you have highly concentrated populations, which you do in cities, a lot of that's worse. So what people are doing, I say people, it's the people who can afford it. They're getting out of the cities, and they're going to nearby suburbs, or even further out, what we call exurbs, which are, the next ring beyond the suburbs. And so there is that demand for housing. I'd be willing to bet money that the place you're describing is a pretty attractive neighborhood. So they're booming, and the same thing's true in the United States. But what's the other side of that? We're depopulating our cities. Cities are the greatest wealth generating phenomena in the history of civilization. I mean, that's what civilization means. It means cities. And so if we're depopulating and draining our wealth creating engine, what does that do to the economy long run? So as an individual choice, it makes sense and I understand it. But the macro effect is we're depopulating these wealth generating places. I mean, just take any downtown area. It could be Melbourne or Adelaide or Sydney or New York for that matter. If there's an attractive downtown office building, let's say you're a large company, insurance company, whatever, and you used to have 10 floors as your corporate headquarters. Well, now everyone's been working from home for almost a year. That's nothing that anyone would have recommended, a year ago. But we were forced to do it. And guess what? It works. Employers and employees are finding that, hey, it works. You can communicate and get stuff done. And maybe there's some attractions to it. So this work from home thing is here to stay. What companies will do, they'll say, well, instead of 10 floors, I only need 2 floors and I'll have attractive offices, but you'll reserve them. You'll call up and say, hey, I need an office 2 days next week to meet some clients. Done. They'll build locker rooms. They won't be like high school locker rooms. They'll be very attractive. You'll keep your laptop and your sweater and your scarf or whatever in your locker. You'll show up, take your stuff out of your locker. Some receptionist will tell you which office is yours for those 2 days. Set yourself up, meet your clients, go home and work from home. What does that mean? If you cut commercial real estate capacity or utilization by 80%, we'll start with the cleaning crew and the reception, but what about the food trucks, the restaurants, the shopping, the public transportation, drinks after work, on and on and on, all the things that are ancillary to that downtown office location. You cut that by 50 to 80%. What is that doing to your economy? So these are examples. By the way, this will take a year to play out. This is not an overnight thing. So the tenants are not paying rent. If they are, they've called up and negotiated a 50% increase. I have some involvement in commercial real estate, and I see this in real time. So rents are down by perhaps half or all the way to zero if they're not paying. And everyone says, well, landlords are rich. No, they're not. The landlords take the rents, but they have mortgages. So if the tenants aren't paying the landlords can't pay the mortgagee, and that falls on the banks, right? Except the banks are clever. They've securitized it and sold it probably to you and me, right? We have our 401ks like a superannuation fund, but you look in the fund and do you have some commercial real estate REIT or something that Morgan Stanley sold you? Well, maybe you do. And what's inside? No one knows, but take a look. But that ripple effect I just described can take a year to play out. So we haven't seen the end of this. So the bottom line on all this is that interest rates are going up in anticipation of inflation based on handouts. The reality is the handouts are not being spent, they're being saved, which does nothing for inflation. And it's also not sustainable, which is what are you going to do? Hand out a $2 trillion deficit spending package every 6 months? Because that's kind of what we've been doing since last summer. And they keep saying, well, this is the last one. It'll be sustainable. It's not sustainable. It's a handout and people need the money. But if they put it in the bank, which they're doing, this is a classic liquidity trap. So what's going to happen? Yeah. But meanwhile, the interest rates are going up, perhaps for the wrong reason, but they're going up. That's going to slow the economy further. We're already seeing mortgage applications dry up. We're seeing the housing not bubble, but pretty steep increase in residential housing starting to level up. So by, hard to say, but I would say by March or April, this whole thing is going to go in reverse. Everything we just talked about is going to go in reverse. The economy is not going to have the traction. Unemployment is going to remain high. Velocity is going to continue to drop. There's not going to be any inflation. Those interest rates are headwind. They're going to drop and the price of gold is going to shoot up. So my advice to potential gold investors is it's on sale. Go get some right now. It's always better to buy low and sell high. And but I would expect the price to be much higher by mid-year.
I know that you've said this before, or I'm pretty sure you've said this before, that to stimulate an economy, you need to reduce interest rates by somewhere around 3-4% to have an effect. When interest rates are currently at zero, how can you do that? Where do you go from zero?
Well, a couple of things. The short answer is you can't. You in theory, you can go to negative rates, but negative rates don't work. We have experience from the ECB, Sweden, Japan, Switzerland, elsewhere, that negative rates don't work. They're negative rates, but they don't. It's not more of the same. Cutting rates from 3% to zero has a beneficial effect, but cutting them from 0 to -1, now you're through the looking glass. You don't get any more pop. You don't get any more bang for the buck. And there are reasons for that, which are what, as a central bank, what signal are you sending? Well, see, the idea of negative rates is you're going to spend the money, because if I'm going to take it away, you put money in the bank, even at 0, you put money in the bank, you go away for a year, come back, the same amount of money should be there. That's the 0 interest rate. But a negative interest rate, -1%, you put $100,000 in the bank, you go away for a year, you come back, you only have $99,000. Because I took $1,000, that's 1% negative interest. So the idea is, if I'm going to take your money, you're going to spend it fast because you don't want me to take your money. And that's going to have the stimulative effect that we talked about. That's not actually what happens. What happens, two things. Number one, people have lifetime goals. Their retirement, their healthcare, their parents' healthcare, their children's education, buying a house. There's some large lifetime goal you have, and that's why you save money in the first place. If I'm taking your money away, you're going to save more, not less. You still want to achieve that goal. I've made it more difficult, but you're actually going to save more. They want you to spend it, but now you're saving more. And the second thing is, what signal is a central bank sending when they have negative interest rates? They're saying that they're worried about deflation, not inflation, but deflation. Yeah. So if they're telling me, if central bank is telling me that deflation is a problem, I'm going to wait. And why should I buy anything right now? Wait till the price drops. And by the way, a negative interest rate, -1%, my example, is a nominal phenomena. But in real terms, if you have deflation, my money is worth more. So even though my dollar amount may be less, my purchasing power went up because prices went down. And so that's why negative interest rates don't work, because A, you're sending a deflation signal, so people defer spending, and B, they have lifetime goals, so they actually save more. So negative rates don't work. So you're right, you're stuck at 0, there you are. Pardon me, you can do QE, you can do quantitative easing. And usually what happens is they hand the ball over, I don't know if it's a rugby match or whatever, but they hand the ball from monetary policy, which is now impotent, to fiscal policy, which is deficit spending. But there you have other kinds of headwinds having to do with very high debt levels. More to the point, in terms of what a central bank can actually do, they can't stimulate. They can print money, and governments can spend money and incur deficit spending. But again, none of it does any good if people don't actually spend it, and that's a psychological phenomenon. And the Fed or the Reserve Bank of Australia or any central bank can print money, no doubt about it, but they can't change people's psychology. We had an external shock, an exogenous shock in the form of the pandemic that caused people to stop spending, save more, or they were unemployed. Or if you're the unemployed individual, you're not taking your friends out for dinner these days. You're putting money in the bank. And even if you still have your job, you're going to save money because you're worried you might be next. You might be the next one to get laid off, or your company might shut down next week or next month. And so you're going to save more. It's what economists call precautionary savings, or, in plain English, saving for a rainy day. And that's what's going on. It's going on all over the world.
The debt's not going up at 2% or 3%. The debt's going up 8, 9, 10% or more. The U.S. had a $1 trillion baseline budget deficit, $1 trillion per year deficit for fiscal 2020 pre-pandemic. The Congress threw $3 trillion of emergency aid on top of that. And I'm not even criticizing all those programs. I mean, the payroll protection plan loans, the extended unemployment benefits, the increased unemployment benefits. Imagine where we'd be if we hadn't done that. But that aside, debt is debt. They piled $3 trillion on top. Now, this is going to take the U.S. debt to GDP ratio up to 135%. It was 106% when Donald Trump was sworn in. It's close to 130% today. Because remember, you got two things going on. It's a debt to GDP. So debt's your numerator and GDP is your denominator, right? Well, what happened? Well, the denominator shrank. This got smaller and this got bigger. So what happens to the ratio? It blows up. So now it's 135%. If you get the laws of economics right, which is not easy because most economists don't, but if you get them right, it's really a reflection of human nature. I mean, what is an economy other than all the people in the economy starting businesses, buying, selling, traveling, providing goods and services, et cetera. So human nature doesn't change, or at least it hasn't changed much in the last 100,000 years. So the fundamental laws of economics don't change either, but circumstances change, facts change, and that's important. Now, to answer your question, Kerry, you're right. There is a school of thought, a growing one, an influential one, that the debt doesn't matter. It's like, well, wait a second. So what? So the debt to GDP ratio went to 135%, which it did. Who cares? Well, what's wrong with it? 180%. We got issues. We got problems. Print up the money and monetize the debt and spend it and keep going. What is the problem? This comes under the banner of something called modern monetary theory, MMT. It's flawed, it's wrong, but it's got its followers, and those followers are now in the White House because one of the things Joe Biden had to do to get elected was to make peace with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. They take the view that if the Treasury didn't spend the money, how would anybody make any money? That's ridiculous, but that's what they say. They say, hey, when the Treasury spends money, what do? Well, they build aircraft. They have benefit programs. They have government contracts. They do whatever they do. But when the Treasury gives you the money, you take the money and you spend it on somebody else, goods and services, go out to dinner, have subcontractors, whatever it might be. That's the real source of money. They also take the Treasury and the Fed and they merge them. Now, that's not legally the case. The Treasury and the Fed are separate institutions. The Treasury is just part of the executive branch, and the Fed is an independent agency. And the Federal Reserve banks are actually privately owned. That a lot of people know. Some people know that, some people don't. But the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned by banks in the districts, so Citibank, Bank of America, et cetera. So they're completely separate. But the theorists ignore that and say no. The Treasury needs to spend money because that's how the economy grows, and the Fed can monetize the debt. So you spend the money you don't have, you borrow to cover it, you issue bonds to cover the borrowing, and if the market wants to buy the bonds, fine. But if not, the Fed can buy them and put them away on the balance sheet, wait 30 years and collect the money. What's the problem? Who cares about the debt to GDP ratio? It's kind of a statistical abstract, but why should that stand in the way of using money to solve our problems, which are free healthcare, free childcare, free tuition, forgiveness of student loans? That's a $1.6 trillion ticket, by the way. And look, everyday readers and investors, there's no reason they should know all this stuff. This is total inside baseball. You have to be a geek like me to kind of keep up with it, but it's all coming. But what that means is we're going to test the Rogoff-Reinhardt thesis. Now, let me just take a minute to explain that. Up to a certain debt to GDP ratio, there is a Keynesian multiplier greater than 1. So the classic example is the UK was in a depression before the rest of the world. They have been hit pretty hard before the Wall Street crash. People aren't spending, they're saving. It's the liquidity trap. So if you get money, you pay down debt. When you don't have any debt, you put it in the bank. Whatever you do, you don't spend it. You hoard cash. Or people were buying gold. They were accused of hoarding gold, et cetera. But what they weren't doing was spending. And there was a lack of aggregate demand, and the banks were not lending. So Keynes said, well, if everyday people won't do it, the government must. The government can borrow. The government can spend. And what they discovered was that if you borrow $1 and spend $1, you can get $1.50 of GDP. Now, there's a separate debate as to whether that's actually incremental or whether you're just pulling growth forward. But so what? Even if you are pulling growth forward, maybe that's what you need to do when you're in a liquidity trap. But there's a problem. He called it the general theory of employment, interest, and money. But it was actually a special theory. I think he had a little Einstein in me because of the general theory of relativity, but it's actually a special theory, which means it's a theory that works in a set of circumstances, a set of conditions. The conditions where it works are you're either in a recession or just coming out of one. You have excess capacity and labor and industrial capacity, and you have very little debt. In those circumstances, you can borrow $1, spend $1, and get more than $1 GDP. The problem is that extra GDP you get for the borrowing and spending, it goes down as the debt to GDP ratio goes up. What Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered is that at 90%, you go through the looking glass. Your payoff is now less than $1. You borrow $1, you spend $1, and you only get 90 cents of GDP or 95 cents, et cetera. So now, not only are you not getting your dollar's worth for the borrowed dollar or something more, which you did at lower levels, you're getting less than $1. So now what's happening? You're borrowing $1, you're spending $1, you're not getting $1 of GDP, but you are getting $1 of debt, which means your debt to GDP ratio is going up and the 90% is getting worse. And I just mentioned the United States is at 135%. So here are your two competing schools. There's the Keynesian multiplier and creating aggregate demand with government debt, and the Reinhardt-Rogoff, more than a thesis, I would say powerful evidence that beyond 90%, it doesn't work. It goes under less than one on the one hand. And my friend Stephanie Kelton and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and the modern monetary theorists who say, no, it's all good. How could you get growth if you didn't spend money through the government? These theories don't agree at all. We're going to find out which ones work. I'll give away the answer, which is that Reinhardt and Rogoff have it right. Keynes had it right up to a point. Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered that critical threshold, that whether you want to call it tipping point or phase transition, or which physicists call it or whatever. The modern monetary theorists think the opposite, and we're going to find out. But what it means, if Reinhardt and Rogoff are right, and I'm right, and Keynes was right, the more you borrow, it's actually a headwind to growth. Now you get just as up to the threshold, you got more and more and more. Oh, sorry, at a low level, you got more, but then it went down. But it's like any diminishing marginal return. You know, the curve starts very steeply, you get a lot of payoff, then it flattens out, then it goes down, but it's still positive. But at some point, it goes below the zero line and your marginal return is negative. And that's where we are. The debt's not going up at 2% or 3%. The debt's going up 8, 9, 10% or more. The U.S. had a $1 trillion baseline budget deficit, $1 trillion per year deficit for fiscal 2020 pre-pandemic. The Congress threw $3 trillion of emergency aid on top of that. And I'm not even criticizing all those programs. I mean, the payroll protection plan loans, the extended unemployment benefits, the increased unemployment benefits. Imagine where we'd be if we hadn't done that. But that aside, debt is debt. They piled $3 trillion on top. Now, this is going to take the U.S. debt to GDP ratio up to 135%. It was 106% when Donald Trump was sworn in. It's close to 130% today. Because remember, you got two things going on. It's a debt to GDP. So debt's your numerator and GDP is your denominator, right? Well, what happened? Well, the denominator shrank. This got smaller and this got bigger. So what happens to the ratio? It blows up. So now it's 135%. If you get the laws of economics right, which is not easy because most economists don't, but if you get them right, it's really a reflection of human nature. I mean, what is an economy other than all the people in the economy starting businesses, buying, selling, traveling, providing goods and services, et cetera. So human nature doesn't change, or at least it hasn't changed much in the last 100,000 years. So the fundamental laws of economics don't change either, but circumstances change, facts change, and that's important. Now, to answer your question, Kerry, you're right. There is a school of thought, a growing one, an influential one, that the debt doesn't matter. It's like, well, wait a second. So what? So the debt to GDP ratio went to 135%, which it did. Who cares? Well, what's wrong with it? 180%. We got issues. We got problems. Print up the money and monetize the debt and spend it and keep going. What is the problem? This comes under the banner of something called modern monetary theory, MMT. It's flawed, it's wrong, but it's got its followers, and those followers are now in the White House because one of the things Joe Biden had to do to get elected was to make peace with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. They take the view that if the Treasury didn't spend the money, how would anybody make any money? That's ridiculous, but that's what they say. They say, hey, when the Treasury spends money, what do? Well, they build aircraft. They have benefit programs. They have government contracts. They do whatever they do. But when the Treasury gives you the money, you take the money and you spend it on somebody else, goods and services, go out to dinner, have subcontractors, whatever it might be. That's the real source of money. They also take the Treasury and the Fed, and they merged them. Now, that's not legally the case. The Treasury and the Fed are separate institutions. The Treasury is just part of the executive branch, and the Fed is an independent agency. And the Federal Reserve banks are actually privately owned. That a lot of people know. Some people know that, some people don't. But the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned by banks in the districts, so Citibank, Bank of America, et cetera. So they're completely separate. But the theorists ignore that and say, no, the Treasury needs to spend money because that's how the economy grows, and the Fed can monetize the debt. So you spend the money you don't have, you borrow to cover it, you issue bonds to cover the borrowing, and if the market wants to buy the bonds, fine. But if not, the Fed can buy them and put them away on the balance sheet, wait 30 years and collect the money. What's the problem? Who cares about the debt to GDP ratio? It's kind of a statistical abstract, but why should that stand in the way of using money to solve our problems, which are free healthcare, free childcare, free tuition, forgiveness of student loans? That's a $1.6 trillion ticket, by the way. And look, everyday readers and investors, there's no reason they should know all this stuff. This is total inside baseball. You have to be a geek like me to kind of keep up with it, but it's all coming. But what that means is we're going to test the Rogoff-Reinhardt thesis. Now, let me just take a minute to explain that. Up to a certain debt to GDP ratio, there is a Keynesian multiplier greater than 1. So the classic example is the UK was in a depression before the rest of the world. They have been hit pretty hard before the Wall Street crash. People aren't spending, they're saving. It's the liquidity trap. So if you get money, you pay down debt. When you don't have any debt, you put it in the bank. Whatever you do, you don't spend it. You hoard cash. Or people were buying gold. They were accused of hoarding gold, et cetera. But what they weren't doing was spending. And there was a lack of aggregate demand, and the banks were not lending. So Keynes said, well, if everyday people won't do it, the government must. The government can borrow. The government can spend. And what they discovered was that if you borrow $1 and spend $1, you can get $1.50 of GDP. Now, there's a separate debate as to whether that's actually incremental or whether you're just pulling growth forward. But so what? Even if you are pulling growth forward, maybe that's what you need to do when you're in a liquidity trap. But there's a problem. He called it the general theory of employment, interest, and money. But it was actually a special theory. I think he had a little Einstein in me because of the general theory of relativity. But it's actually a special theory, which means it's a theory that works in a set of circumstances, a set of conditions. The conditions where it works are you're either in a recession or just coming out of one. You have excess capacity and labor and industrial capacity, and you have very little debt. In those circumstances, you can borrow $1, spend $1, and get more than $1 GDP. The problem is that extra GDP you get for the borrow and spend, it goes down as the debt to GDP ratio goes up. What Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered is that at 90%, you go through the looking glass. Your payoff is now less than $1. You borrow $1, you spend $1, and you only get 90 cents of GDP or 95 cents, et cetera. So now, not only are you not getting your dollar's worth for the borrowed dollar or something more, which you did at lower levels, you're getting less than $1. So now what's happening? You're borrowing $1, you're spending $1, you're not getting $1 of GDP, but you are getting $1 of debt, which means your debt to GDP ratio is going up and the 90% is getting worse. And I just mentioned the United States is at 135%. So here are your two competing schools. There's the Keynesian multiplier and creating aggregate demand with government debt, and the Reinhardt-Rogoff, more than a thesis, I would say powerful evidence that beyond 90%, it doesn't work. It goes under less than 1 on the one hand. And my friend Stephanie Kelton and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and the modern monetary theorists who say, no, it's all good. How could you get growth if you didn't spend money through the government? These theories don't agree at all. We're going to find out which ones work. I'll give away the answer, which is that Reinhardt and Rogoff have it right. Keynes had it right up to a point. Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered that critical threshold, that whether you want to call it tipping point or phase transition, or which physicists call it or whatever. The modern monetary theorists think the opposite, and we're going to find out. But what it means, if Reinhardt and Rogoff are right, and I'm right, and Keynes was right, the more you borrow, it's actually a headwind to growth. Now you get just as up to the threshold, you got more and more and more. Oh, sorry, at a low level, you got more, but then it went down. But it's like any diminishing marginal return. You know, the curve starts very steeply, you get a lot of payoff, then it flattens out, then it goes down, but it's still positive. But at some point, it goes below the zero line and your marginal return is negative. And that's where we are. The U.S. is heading into a recession, and we may be in a recession. Everyone's like, wait a second. Yesterday, GDP was up 5%. And it was. That was the number for it was the first government estimate for the third quarter of 2023. It was up 5%, but it was very heavy on consumption and very heavy on inventory. When wholesalers and distributors build up inventory, that counts as GDP. Well, it's fine to build up inventory if people are buying the stuff, but if they don't buy the stuff and you're up to the rafters in inventory, you got to start writing it down. This is where you see, you go to the Gap and you get like 10 shirts and 5 pairs of jeans for $30. I mean, the inventory situation comes down to the consumer. Are people buying stuff? It looks like the consumer hit the brakes in August. Now, the second quarter is July, August, September. Sometime around mid to late August, after 2 pretty strong months, and they were strong, the consumers just hit the brakes. Now, they've done enough to make the third quarter strong, but going into the fourth quarter, they may just not show up for the game. A couple of reasons for that. Number one is during the pandemic, you go back to 2020, 2021, what was going on? Well, starting with Trump in, I think, June 2020, he gave everybody a $1,400 check. If you got a heartbeat, you got a check. And then Trump did it again in December 2020, just before he left office. It was another $600 check. Biden comes in and says, well, I can top that. And Biden does in February 2021, right after he was sworn in. Here comes another $1,600 check. And then when people got those checks, they saved a lot of it. So what happened in 2023? People drew down their savings. The savings rate got really low. Like, they spent the savings they had. They didn't make new savings. And then they turned to the credit cards and ran up their credit card balances. Well, that feels good for a while. But then if you're paying the minimum and rolling over the balance and you're at your limit, your credit limit's used up, and the interest rates are 20%, some of them are 28%, you're going to double that balance in 3 years. So if you're like, I'll just pay the minimum this month and we'll figure it out, your balance is going up because the interest is compounding faster than you're paying it down at 25%. So people are tapped down on their credit cards. They've used up their savings. They're getting into a deeper hole because the interest is compounding faster than they can pay off the credit cards. And they're just backing away. And it's showing up in things like gasoline consumption. It's way down. The demand for gasoline is what economists call inelastic, meaning you just have to buy it no matter what the price is. You got to take the kids to school or get to work or go shop, whatever it is. You're just going to buy the gasoline even if you don't like the price. By the way, lately prices have been coming down a little bit, which is another, that sounds good, but it's actually a bad sign because it's disinflationary, which kind of leans in the direction of a recession. But for gasoline consumption to drop, forgetting about the price, that means people are not driving. They're not going on vacation. They're not doing road trips. They're not driving any more than they have to. There are a lot of other signs. We don't have time to get into all the technicals with negative swap spreads and inverted yield curves and all the rest. But it does look like the consumer slammed on the brakes around late August, early September. The fourth quarter could be a disaster. The stock market's starting to wake up to that fact. So I would say it's a pretty simple recommendation, Matt. Reduce your exposure to stocks overall. Increase your exposure to cash. It'll give you, you won't lose money on cash, assuming that inflation is not bad, and it'll give you a lot of optionality. You can go, if things get really, really, really bad, if you have cash, you can go shopping and find some bargains. But if you're in stocks and they go bad, you're just going to lose that money and never see it again. But if you do have stocks or some stocks, I would look at energy, defense, not for good reasons, there's enough wars going on, but defense will do well, and mining because gold and silver prices and strategic minerals will do well. So defense, mining, and energy are the sectors I'd be in. I'd lighten up on tech, get out of everything else,
go to cash. Treasury notes look attractive here because interest rates are going to start to come down. I know they've been going up. I get it. But it looks like they peaked and have turned around. So Treasury notes, a 2-year note, a 5-year note, will perform very well, and they're very safe, obviously. And just take it from there. But you've got to be tuned into the geopolitics to understand the stock market. You can treat them as separate subjects, but if the world's falling apart, so that's not good for stocks. Right. So when we say bond markets, Matt, we have to be careful which bond market. I'm talking about the U.S. Treasury bond market. The short-term Treasuries, 4-month bills, 6-month bills, up to 1 year. The funny thing now is that the highest yields in the U.S. Treasury market are in like a 6-month bill. Like, wait a second, shouldn't I get more if I buy a 30-year bond, or shouldn't I get more if I buy a 10-year note? It's a longer maturity, more stuff can happen, inflation, bank freezes, all those things can happen. I want a higher interest rate for my longer term security. That's usually the way the yield curve looks. It's upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the higher the rate. That's not true today. The highest maturities are right around 6-month bills, 1-year bills, going out to 2-year notes. When you get to the 10-year note, you actually get a lower interest rate, lower what's called yield to maturity than you do on a 2-year note. The interesting thing about 2 years is you get a high rate, but it's less volatile than a 10-year note. It's more liquid. 10-year notes are pretty liquid, but 2-year notes are very liquid. So you can actually have the best of both worlds. You can have a shorter maturity, which means less risk in some ways, and a higher interest rate. So it's like I said, the best of both worlds. But the highest interest rate is actually from 6 months to 1 year. So those are very, very safe securities, and they're paying like 5.25%, not quite 5.5%, but between 5.25% and 5.5% for a 6-month Treasury bill. Why wouldn't you just buy one of those? I mean, it's more than what you get in the bank. Now, the answer is, well, yeah, Jim, that sounds good, but if interest rates go up even more, you're going to lose money on your capital. The value of the note or bond will go down if interest rates go up. That's bond math 101. Rates go up, prices go down. The opposite is true. Rates go down, prices go up. So you can make or lose money, but that inverse relationship kind of throws a lot of people, but that's just how it works. So yeah, buying a 2-year note that yields about 5.1%, very liquid, very safe, good return, more than your bank will pay you, more than most stocks will pay you. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, the answer is, if you think the 2-year note is going to go to 6%, you might not like it, because you're going to, if you hold it for 2 years, you'll get your money back. But if you want to sell in the meantime, you're going to have a capital loss on the note itself. So therefore, the next level of analysis is, well, what's going to happen to interest rates? Everybody wants to know that. In my view, they've peaked. They're going to come down. And if you like that action, you might prefer the 10-year note, because a longer maturity has a higher, not to get too technical, it's called DV01, dollar value 1 basis point. And what it means is that, so interest rates come down a certain amount, 25 basis points, 50 basis points, or whatever. And I said bond prices go up, which they do. But how much do they go up? Well, the answer is, the longer the maturity, the more they go up. They're more volatile. And so the 2-year note's a really attractive piece of paper, very safe. You get your money back, liquid, you can get out of it, etc. The only reason not to buy would be if you thought rates are going to go up. I don't. I think they're coming down from here on out. But if you accept that view, then the 10-year note is going to have the biggest capital gains. Now, again, it's riskier. When I say risky, I'm talking about market risk. I'm not talking about credit risk. You are going to get your money back. But from a market risk point of view, if you had to sell it, a year from now or 6 months from now, for that matter, if rates go up, you're going to lose a little money on the value of the note itself. But if rates come down, not only do you get the 5% interest rate, which is sweet, but you're going to have a capital gain on the note, because that's what happens when rates come down. So the big question is, have rates peaked? And I would say they have. And I base that on what I said earlier about the economy. If we're going into a recession, we're going into a slowdown, we're looking at all kinds of geopolitical risk, stocks are coming down, then interest rates are going to come down too.